say a word of thanks to the museum for being here, to Ritchie, of course, and I want to say welcome to townfolk, to Randolph-Macon alumni. We have one here from Atlanta and another from Chesapeake. Did anybody come from farther away than Atlanta? Oh. I'm glad you're all here. Randolph-Macon's English professor, Tom Pizer, had hoped to be here to introduce Ritchie, but unfortunately is not able to make it. So I'm reading what he wrote. Henry James famously remarked that it is a complex fate being an American, and Ritchie Watson's books have done much to elucidate the corollary, that it is a complex fate being a Southern American. Tonight we gathered to hear about the latest in what is now a tetralogy of works shedding light on the mental landscape of Southerners, especially in the fraught years leading up to the Civil War. In his first two books, The Cavalier in Virginia Fiction and Yeoman versus Cavalier, The Old Southwest's Fictional Road to Rebellion, Ritchie documented the grip that the myth of the Virginia Cavalier had on the Southern imagination, so that even residents of, for example, Arkansas and Tennessee began to feel more culturally akin to the grandees of the Eastern Seaboard than to the Buckeyes or Illinoisans, who in their outward circumstances they may have more resembled. Professor Watson thus showed how ideas, even ideas implicit in novels and poems, can play their part in shaping the destiny of peoples. His next book, Normans and Saxons, Southern Race Mythology and the Intellectual History of the American Civil War, focused on a largely forgotten vogue among antebellum white Southerners of fancying themselves the descendants of chivalric, warm-hearted Normans, as distinct from the spawn of coldly calculating Saxons who dominated the North. Scholars here might cast an envious eye on the fact that with Normans and Saxons, Professor Watson broke loose from the Library of Congress call number classification, that's a mouthful, that confines most of his tribe, PS, for American literature, and earned a call number beginning with F for United States local history. Now, with the book that we will hear about tonight, Grand Emporium, Mercantile Monster, the Antebellum South's love-hate affair with New York City, Ritchie has moved to yet a third region of the stacks, with a Library of Congress call number with an H at the front for social science. Taken together and given the sometimes fraught role that race and region continue to play in our national life, Professor Watson's works provide critical context for and perspective on the last 2 centuries of American culture, and demonstrate once again the wisdom of words spoken by a Faulkner character: the past is never dead, it's not even past. So I give you our revered professor, teacher, colleague and friend, literary critic, historian, and now social scientist, Ritchie Watson.
Thank you, Rhonda. That's a very impressive introduction, and I hardly recognize myself, which I guess is the mark of a great introduction, right? I'm surprised and delighted and highly flattered to see among the faces in this room not only those of friends who've known me a long time, but some of my former students. I should say some of my favorite students. Any teacher worth his salt will testify that there's nothing more personally gratifying than having one's former scholars turn up for an event like this, and I'm deeply appreciative and love to see you out there. If I can repurpose a phrase that was coined by Hillary Clinton, say it takes a village to put on this program tonight, it did take a village, a lot of people working to bring this together, and I'm extremely grateful. The Ashland Museum with Betsy Hodges, of course, and Martin, and the college, of course, Rhonda, Barclay DePriest, managing of one of the great college bookstores on the East Coast. Tom Heiser, who so graciously provided the introduction tonight, though he couldn't be here. They all helped to put this program together. Tom Wolfe, who is our Ashland Cecil B. DeMille, he's recording it, and I do appreciate that. I also need to mention the McGraw-Page Library here at the college. Lori Preston and Linda Wright, I believe I see Linda here. They were so helpful to me in the years I was researching and writing this book, whether helping me track down a source or reckoning the price in 21st century dollars of a $100 women's cape sold in New York in 1840. I mean, that's the sort of stuff I would run to ask for help, and they were above and beyond always in helping me. I do appreciate that. And last but certainly not least, I should express my appreciation for Sue Forbes Watson, my wife. Many years ago, my grandmother said, and I never forgot this, anybody who goes through life needs a sponsor. And for over 50 years, Sue has been my sponsor, loyal, devoted, and very much a part of my life. I'm very grateful for her to be a part of my life. Thank you. Now I'm going to get through this. I want to get through before I take too much time. I'm just as nervous as I'll get it. I mean, it's been 15 years since I really got up for a bunch of classes, and I thought I was going to sail through this, and I'm just a wreck right now. What I wanted to talk about tonight was how I happened to come to write this last book, and what I learned in the process those years, very leisurely moving in retirement, what I learned in the process of writing it. I start way back in 2006, in the summer of 2006. I was finishing the research on this book. Here's a little self-promotion. This is Normans and Saxons. It's in paperback. And it's about what Tom Heiser was talking about, how Southerners in the years before the Civil War suddenly started fantasizing that they were Norman Cavaliers and New Englanders and all those living above the Mason-Dixon line were a bunch of vulgar Saxons and all that sort of thing. How you invent race to create difference, not to bridge differences, but to create difference. I was researching that summer, wrapping it up really, odds and ends, at the New York Historical Society, which is a grand edifice on Central Park West with a wonderful collection. And on my way to the reading room one afternoon, I saw there was an exhibition going on at the front of the building. And I was curious, and I decided to take a look at it before I went in. This detour resulted in this book, really, because today that exhibit is considered one of the Historical Society's major exhibitions of the last few decades. The title of it was, and that intrigued me, New York Divided, Slavery and the Civil War. And for me, a literary scholar and not a historian, it was an eye-opener and a real revelation. Until the day I drifted into this exhibit, I had no idea that New York City was so deeply indebted to Southern cotton for its astonishing and meteoric rise between 1820 and 1860 into the ranks of the world's major cities. Extraordinary growth of the city. And most of it had to do with cotton, as I learned. I had not known that because of its dominance of the enormously lucrative trade in slave-produced cotton, Gotham had quickly acquired the reputation among Northerners of being by far the most pro-Southern in its sympathies of all the cities lying north of the Mason-Dixon line. Nor had I realized that despite this mutually profitable economic and political alliance between New York and the antebellum plantation South, gradually rising abolitionist sentiment in the North, and increasing unease among New Yorkers themselves over the morality of the institution of chattel slavery would make the alliance between Gotham and the South, as the decades progressed, increasingly fraught and conflicted. For the next 15 years or so, and even before the publication of that Normans and Saxons book, I set about researching, analyzing, and detailing this complex 4-decade-long, what I call love-hate affair between antebellum Southerners and New York City. Grand Emporium, Mercantile Monster is the end product of this process, and LSU Press does a marvelous job printing, and I wish I had thought to put it up on the screen. The Dust Jacket, which is a lithograph of New York in the 1850s, they reproduced that on the hardbound book itself. When I saw that, I thought, great, I've got it. And you can see, you can get some sense of how rapidly this city, expanded between 1800 and 1860. Miles and miles going up Manhattan Island and over in Brooklyn as well. So, one of the most surprising things I learned, so writing the book was a process of education for me too. I didn't know about any of this stuff, had the vaguest idea about these things. I learned how quickly the city established both its financial and cultural supremacy in the new nation. I had no idea how rapidly New York had done that, leaping beyond the other cities like Boston, Philadelphia. By the time cotton had become a major source of wealth in 1820, Gotham's banks and merchant houses and its impressive fleet of cargo ships had solidified its dominance of the cotton trade between the southern plantations and New England, English, and European markets. No other city, north or south, could seriously compete with it, not Charleston, not even New Orleans. Equally surprising to me was that the mercantile and cultural dominance that Gotham was also beginning to exert in America was very powerful by 1820, 1830. The city's rapidly expanding Manhattan urban core offered a wealth of metropolitan pleasures that no other American city could match, and wealthy Southerners, infused with the profits from slave-produced cotton, were beginning to descend on the city mostly during the summer months in ever-increasing numbers. This was also a great surprise. Tens of thousands of Southerners were coming up to New York every summer for long stays. Gotham's magnetic appeal is on vivid display in the travel letters written by a wealthy Charleston matron to her son in 1818. These letters were so wonderful to discover and so interesting, striking to me, that I began the novel quoting from them. And so, with your permission, I will read from the opening paragraphs of the book. That this is what I thought I have to start my book with these letters. They're just wonderful. On May 13th, 1818, Charlestonian Anne Wagner sent a letter to her son, Effingham, describing with great enthusiasm her experience as a tourist in the bustling and rapidly growing city of New York. The musical and operatic culture she encountered there ranked particularly high in her estimation. The previous week, for example, she had gone to hear Phillips sing in the play of The Devil's Bridge. I could never track that down. Couldn't find it. But she had seen it or heard it somewhere else and thought it was spectacular in New York. His Song of Fancy sketch, she raved, had exceeded anything I ever heard. Indeed, Wagner judged that she had never seen an opera performed in so great a style since I left England. So she'd been born and raised in England. So enraptured was she by the singing that she assured her son she would attend another performance before the artist left the city. The Charleston matron was as impressed with the variety and price of New York's merchandise as she was with its cultural offerings. The food markets especially delighted her. The meat and fish is beautiful. And the asparagus, I'm charmed. Very often, I go to market and wish I could send you some of the good things. The salmon is the only thing I see that's high, about 75 cents per pound. Anne Wagner's travels would take her on to Philadelphia, Providence, and Boston. Yet the lure of New York City seems to have surpassed that of the other northern towns. By mid-October, she was long past the time her family apparently expected her back in Charleston. She was still there 5 months later. She was in Manhattan, slightly, but by no means fully contrite for being away from home for more than 5 months. Though she was, quote, sorry to think that you all have expected me home before the 1st of September, Wagner wrote in a letter dated October 17, 1818. She went on to observe somewhat archly that it had not been her intent when she left home to return sooner. In response to her son's complaints that she had not written home often enough, she replied, I am certain I wrote you in Boston and on my return to New York, and in all have written you 5 times since I left home. So, about a letter a month. As much as she disliked being taken to task for being a lax correspondent, she seems to have been even more offended by her son's implication that she had been seduced into extravagance by the mercantile pleasures of Gotham. With barely concealed resentment, she reminded her son that she had properly acknowledged the receipt of both of your remittances, which I am much indebted to you for. I hope it has all been out of funds received from rents, interest, and wages that became due since I left home, as I should be very much hurt to think I had put you to any trouble. It's her money. It's her money. She can spend it as she wants. If she gave the family in Charleston too much trouble, she couldn't help it, she said. I quote her there, couldn't help it. She was spending her money as profligate Southern tourists would for years to come. She was enjoying the pleasures of a real city, a charming place, she called it. Compared to Charleston, she found New York to be a new world. So that had opened the book. And what it established is how early wealthy Southerners were beginning to come up, by boat mostly. Anne Wagner's 1818 visit would turn out to be a harbinger of things to come. The annual summer ascent by sailboat, steamboat, and later locomotive of thousands of wealthy planters and their families to New York to do business, to shop for luxury goods, to enjoy Gotham's multifarious cultural offerings. Wagner's favorable comparison of the city's operatic offerings to those she had enjoyed in London suggests what I discovered to be the metropolis's early and alluring appeal for a rurally oriented but very wealthy planter class. Unless they had been fortunate enough to travel to England and the continent, Southern planters had never seen or experienced an urban core like Manhattan. In the early decades of the 19th century, Charleston and New Orleans boasted developed centers of approximately 1 square mile. By 1820, with a population that well exceeded 100,000 inhabitants, Central City, New York, extended over 2 miles. And in the 4 decades that followed, Gotham exploded up north, up Manhattan Island, by another 3 miles. It's almost a mile a decade. By 1860, this dense urban expanse had reached Union Square, and development this above Greenwich Village, and it was moving even faster north, approaching Midtown Manhattan by 1860. There was no city in the South or anywhere in the United States really remotely comparable in either size or demographic diversity to the metropolis on the Hudson, with a population that on the verge of the Civil War already exceeded 1 million. So from 100,000 plus in 1820 to 1 million in 1860. That's just rather astonishing. Flushed with profits from their slave-produced cotton, Southern planters were rich tourists. Like well-heeled visitors today, they avoided Gotham's festering slums, and New York had plenty of those. Slums such as 5 Points, which is on the Lower East Side today, close to what we now call Chinatown. They concentrated a few blocks west along the shops, luxury hotels, theaters that were concentrated on Broadway below 14th Street. This was New York City's 19th century equivalent of Fifth Avenue and Times Square combined. As the city's center of gravity migrated up Broadway over the decades, so did Southern tourists. They came to see theater and opera. They came to sleep and dine at luxurious hostelries such as the Astor House. They came to shop at Emporium such as Tiffany and Company and the Ball and Black Jewelry Company, located almost directly across the street from one another. And they came to witness the exotic displays of Barnum's American Museum, Tom Thumb, and all the rest. They came to see renowned Swedish soprano Jenny Lind's American debut. They came to the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1853, inspired by the 1851 London original. It took New York 2 years to figure out how to copy that. And they came to see the elaborately staged entry of the Prince of Wales into Manhattan in 1860. The responses of Southern tourists to Gotham, recorded in period letters and travel diaries, are detailed in my second chapter. And this is maybe my favorite chapter because you found just wonderful comments in letters and in travel narratives of what they were spending, where they were going, what they thought of what they saw. I discovered, perhaps not surprisingly, that Southern visitors responded to the Big Apple in the 19th century rather like they respond to it in the 21st century. Some were captivated by it, some despised it, and some loved and hated it, either in turn or simultaneously, depending on the circumstances. But love it or hate it, wealthy Southern planters had to come to Gotham, had to, if they were serious about their finances or their shopping. And New Yorkers were happy to receive them. Whatever their private scruples about the morality of chattel slavery, they, New Yorkers, supported the South both politically and financially through their allegiance to the pro-slave elements of the Democrat Party and their banking loans to the great cotton plantations. New York had the banks. Ultimately, the South found New York City's loyalty to to be wanting as the years went on. In the face of increasing attacks on their peculiar institution of slavery from Northern abolitionists during the 1830s and 1840s and into the 1850s, increasingly extreme Southern leaders demanded that Gotham not only support the preservation of slavery in the Southern states, but also its expansion into the new federal territories of the West. This was a proposition that even conservative Southern sympathizing New Yorkers could not easily stomach. By the politically volatile and contentious 1850s, increasingly reactionary Southerners were inclined to view New Yorkers as fair-weather friends, grasping, materialistic, concerned only for their own profits. But most of these fire eaters, as they were called, Southern extremists, were also convinced that the city's cupidity and its dependence on Southern cotton for its prosperity made it vulnerable to economic blackmail. As slave states began to leave the Union one by one in the winter of 1861, they did so with the general conviction that, fearing the catastrophic loss of its cotton trade, New York would never actively oppose their withdrawal, and that it would never support detested Republican Abraham Lincoln's call to arms to preserve the Union. Which way would New York go? That was a real question in 1860 and 1861. A big question. It became a question of especially urgent significance at 4:30 on the morning of Friday, April 12, 1861, when shells from an arc of gun emplacements manned by over 500 Confederate troops began to descend on the 80-man federal garrison huddled up in Fort Sumter at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. New York City's answer to their former Southern allies would come loud and clear 7 days later, when the evacuated troops from Fort Sumter garrison arrived in New York Harbor. And here I will read a second passage. This is from the last chapter of my book about how those troops were received when they arrived, exactly 1 week after the bombardment of Fort Sumter. On the morning of Friday, April 19th, as the Baltic, USS Baltic, entered New York Harbor, Captain Abner Doubleday, who was second in command of Fort Sumter, was surprised when he saw that, quote, all the passing steamers saluted us with their steam whistles and bells. To the astonishment and delight of the troops assembled on deck, cheer after cheer went up from the ferry boats and the vessels in the harbor. The American flag that Major Anderson, who commanded the federal forces at Sumter, the American flag that Major Anderson had carefully carried from the fort, now almost in rags, billowed in the breeze behind the Baltic's mainmast. The crowds assembled at Lower Manhattan's Battery Park were so immense that the ship anchored offshore near Governor's Island. With masses on shore cheering heartily, the city dignitaries crowded aboard the Baltic. Anderson was described by one sympathetic observer as being too exhausted and too much overcome by his emotions to speak. He and his troops had not imagined being greeted as heroes, but by this mid-April morning, New York had unanimously determined that the hero's entrance was due them. There was no ticker tape at that time, and no canyon of skyscrapers yet towered over Wall Street. But even as early as 1861, Gotham was known for the scope and impressiveness of its civic receptions, and its celebration of the Fort Sumter veterans would not disappoint expectations. Anderson was immediately carried off to dine, and his men became instant celebrities as well. Doubleday remembered that it was impossible for any of them to venture into the main streets without being ridden on the shoulders of men and torn to pieces by handshaking. President Lincoln clearly understood that Robert Anderson had become a public relations bonanza for his administration. Physically weak and battle-weary though he may have been, after his luncheon he was hurried on to Broadway, where from the balcony of the Ball and Black Jewelry Company he waved the tattered and now precious American flag to a wildly cheering crowd and saluted the departure of the city's famed 7th Regiment to Washington to defend it from Confederate forces then massing both north and south of the capital. George Templeton Strong, a New York businessman and lawyer, kept a fantastic diary, and I quote from him here. Strong's diary records that the Silk Stocking Regiment, as it was termed, composed of the husbands and sons of Gotham's finest families, marched not as on festival days, not as on the reception of the Prince of Wales, but nobly and sternly as men who were going to war. We saw women, we saw men shed tears as they passed. Orrin Gross, watching the departing regiment with a friend, confessed that it was impossible for him to translate either the excitement or the emotion of the occasion. How could one, after all, adequately convey the intensity of feeling released along Broadway as fathers and mothers urged their sons and friends to go and sustain the honor of the country? Though the departure of the 7th Regiment on Friday afternoon was deeply moving, Manhattan had saved its most impressive display of mass patriotism for Saturday, April 20th. Shortly before the arrival of the Baltic, Democrats and Republicans had come together at the Chamber of Commerce to organize an enormous gathering to honor the men whom they considered to be the heroes of Fort Sumter. Indeed, Mariah Daly, another leader of the community, had another wonderful diary. Mariah Daly's diary makes clear that as far as most New Yorkers were concerned, Anderson and his men had left the destroyed fortress with their honor fully intact. Southerners, she bitterly observed, might be celebrating their inglorious victory, but their 7,000 well-armed men, so the number of Confederate troops has exploded from 500 to 7,000. That's what happens. Their 7,000 well-armed men had prevailed over 160 inadequately supplied Union troops who were without provisions and with their magazines surrounded by their burning officers' quarters, were at last obliged to leave it. They had not surrendered the fort, they had evacuated it with the honors of war, saluting the flag, that flag which has never before been humbled since it first floated on the breeze. And Mariah Daly was a Democrat, and she was had been very pro-Southern, but not by April. Organizers of the Saturday mass event had cannily chosen as a venue the aptly named Union Square, then functioning as an imposing northern entrance to the heavily developed city proper, lying south of 14th Street, and distinguished by the equestrian statue of George Washington. On Friday, the New York Times anticipated that the event would doubtless be the largest public meeting ever held in this city, or indeed on this continent, and their prediction was accurate. More than 100,000 New Yorkers flooded the square and the streets around it. In addition, the Times reported that a surging mass of human beings filled Broadway from 14th Street all the way down to the Battery. George Templeton Strong observed that the crowd, or some of them, and the ladies and gentlemen who occupied the windows and lined the house tops all around Union Square sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and the people generally hurrahed a voluntary after each verse. In his diary, Orrin Gross reported that the war-beaten flag of Fort Sumter in its shattered flagstaff floated from the statue of Washington, not since Francis Scott Key had the Stars and Stripes been employed as effectively in the service of national unity. So that was New York within a week of the bombardment. We now knew which way New York would go. Let's see, I've got my pages mixed up here. Here we go. I'm getting near the end. Exactly 1 week after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the citizens of New York City en masse had declared themselves for the Union. The metropolis that had 6 months earlier roundly rejected Abraham Lincoln's presidential candidacy now pledged its unalloyed support for that president's decision to suppress the rebellion by force of arms. Southern confidence that Gotham would not actively oppose secession had been terribly misplaced. But rather than examine their own groupthink complacency, Southerners turned in fury on their former ally. The city they had belittled as a nest of craven money grubbers was now excoriated by the Richmond Daily Dispatch as a monstrous miracle of Satan's own working. The Charleston Courier's verdict was even more annihilating. The interests of Christianity, civilization, humanity, and intelligent self-government, it observed, require that New York should be blotted from the list of cities. If Sodom and Gomorrah were rightfully destroyed, New York cannot stand. So there it is. That was the end of the 40-year relationship. Southern slavery, Southern political reaction, Southern delusions, Southern secession. I was beginning my research into a 19th century historical phenomenon at the beginning of the 21st century. But during the following years of research and writing, I became increasingly aware that these widely separated periods shared disturbing similarities. When I initiated my project, America had elected its first African-American president, and the nation was embarking upon a new century alive with hope and promise. By the time I had begun writing the manuscript of Grand Emporium, Mercantile Monster, another president of a completely different stripe had been swept into office on a wave of reaction. By the time I was finishing my manuscript, mobs were storming the Capitol and Confederate flags were being waved over hallowed halls littered with shattered glass. By the time I was revising and proofing my text, the political party founded on the abolition of slavery and dedicated to the preservation of the Union included influential members who denied the reality of a presidential election result and questioned the legitimacy of a sitting president. By 2023, the words Civil War were being uttered occasionally and provocatively in extreme circles. What century was I living in? Was America repeating a 19th century historical cycle of reaction, xenophobia, and violence? I understood that the historical parallels are not precise. Certainly they're not precise. Yet it seems to me that the locus of this xenophobia and reaction remains in the 21st century as it was in the 19th century, most concentrated in the states of the old Confederacy. That the spirit of reactionism and rebellion against federal authority is most evident in this region of the country. Today, my completed study of the forging and ultimate fracturing of the antebellum alliance between New York City and the plantation South between 1820 and 1860 seems to me to shed unintended light on the divisions and the seemingly irreconcilable visions of what our nation should be in 2024. If the past is indeed prologue to the present, then America's future appears to me to be perhaps an ominous one. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
Ritchie, this may exceed the breadth of your book, but my thinking is that after the Civil War, there was a surge of wealthy generals and so forth in the South who went to New York to get financing. I think Lewis Ginter and the tobacco giant that grew out of that was part of that. So they rushed back. They may have rushed back in. I don't know the research on any of that.
Well,
it's interesting.
I meant to, I was going to have an additional chapter, but I just ran out of steam. I was going to talk about the era, and the irony is that the South saw itself as finally achieving its independence from New York, and then after the war was even more dependent on it. I mean, that was one of the ironies. But I didn't get around to doing that.
It's interesting that John brought that up, because I remember reading another subject back. There was these giant or huge fraternities of Confederate officers in New York City.
Oh, yes.
Big organizations, and I was surprised how many people.
Yeah, New York's affection for Southerners returned very quickly after the war. New Yorkers have always been just as much amnesiac about their history as everybody else. It was a slave-owning city. I go into that in my book too. New York had a significant slave population. It was one of the last northern states to emancipate.
That's surprising too.
So, yes, Confederates were welcome in New York, and well, Jefferson Davis's widow wound up there. And,
Also ironic is they characterize New Yorkers as the North vacating humanity.
Yes.
Its desperate fervor to preserve suppression of slavery and black human rights, and yet they use the term humanity
That's right.
as New York being a core level.
Right. Well, there's another irony. Southerners accuse New Yorkers of being money grubbers. All they care about is money. Well, you know, the cheap cotton, it was slave labor that made those huge fortunes pile up. But, you know, people are always more interested in looking at other people's inadequacies in their own. Yeah.
Just a different prism.
Yeah, a different prison. You're right.
So I take it Savannah and Charleston, they have the same relationship with New York City? I agree with both.
Well, there were New York interests were in both those cities in the financial houses, and New Yorkers sent parts of their family, some of the big merchants like the Browns, sent relatives down there to manage their affairs. They also, New Yorkers had to manage plantations, because when plantations folded, as they sometimes did, bad weather, sunk ship, you know, disasters of various sorts, those plantations sometimes came into the hands of banks, and those banks were often New York banks, and the Brown family, Brown Harriman is still was a financial institution prominent in New York well into the 20th century. The Browns were one of the largest slave-owning families in the country, and they were New Yorkers. I mean, that's why New York's known to be very pro-Southern, but not enough for the South.
Ritchie, one of the things I thought about it earlier, the history of laws related to slavery in the North was not like what people think it is. It wasn't just New York City, New York State that had some pro-slavery things, but Connecticut, for example, and other New England states weren't exactly totally clear on that topic.
No, they weren't. And in fact, New Jersey was later than New York in abolishing slavery. But I don't know, you know. In Pennsylvania, with a strong Quaker element, they were a little different. The Dutch, the original New York Dutch often owned some slaves, used slavery. There were quite a few in rural Brooklyn, when Brooklyn was not a city, but an area of farms. Quite a large number of slaves there. Slavery was not abolished in New York, I think, until 1828, and it didn't officially cease to exist until 1840 because people who were born into slavery were expected to continue until they were 18 or something. So slavery didn't disappear in New York until 1840, yeah.
Ritchie, what happened to the banks and the other entities and institutions that prospered as a result of this relationship with the South before the war?
Yeah.
What happened to them when that got severed? I mean, they must have been less prosperous. They must
Well,
have
it was thought that
fallen on hard times. I
it
don't
was
know.
thought that the city would collapse, that it just wouldn't survive. But I'm not an economist, but the entrepreneurial energy of New York City is just it flabbergasts you. They moved eventually quickly into wheat, into lumber. They had Erie Canal, the railroads.
They quickly
Within
reinvented
6
themselves
months.
with the Civil War actually helped
It
them reinvent
actually-
themselves and continued on with their
Yeah,
financial successes, but in a different
right.
way.
Things were hard in New York for about a year, and there was war and there was unrest. There were the draft riots. I talked about that in my book too. I mean, but the city itself prospered when you went back to it in 1865. That's in my last chapter. People couldn't believe the energy, the prosperity. The New York Stock Exchange, the new building was being built, second only to the London Stock. Cotton got it going and made New York, I think. But it was the energy of the city itself and its unique geographical position that made it. New Yorkers didn't realize how strong they were going to be, how strongly they were going to come out of that war, and they did. We didn't. The South did. They did. Yeah.
I was going to mention the statistic that in 1860, 70% of the GNP of America was created in the South.
Mm-hmm.
But the South only had 37% of the banks. So each Southern family had a connection to New York City, a very strong connection.
Very strong.
In the graduate course I took as an undergraduate with John Franklin at the University of Chicago, he talked about the fact that Southern elites all had a factor, F-A-C-T-O-R, an agent. So if a little girl in Charleston, South Carolina wanted a white piano, that factor would be told that money would be sent to Paris, that Paris would be put on the boat, and she would get her piano at a 40% markup. So the point is that the North benefited from the plantation South
Of course.
far more than the South benefited.
Well, that's what Southerners said. That's what Southerners said.
And if you're really interested, Jack Trammell wrote a book called The Richmond Slave Trade, to which I wrote the introduction. I took graduate courses on this, but reading Jack Trammell's very short book, I learned so much more that Richmond, Virginia was absolutely the most essential place to both the North and the South for development of this nation, particularly during the Civil War, where they fought for wheat, they fought for corn, they fought for pigs, they fought over everything. And they would bid each other out because both sides wanted to acquire those goods. And there was a lot of treachery and dishonest behavior on both sides.
Oh,
of the
sure.
equation.
I have no doubt of that.
Richard,
Where money's concerned.
question. Who was your favorite character in the book or in the research?
These diary writers I quote from, you get George Templeton Straw and Mariah Daly. Strong was a wealthy stockbroker, and he had every reason to be sympathetic to the South, and he was to a certain degree. Very much so, but in 1860 I discovered he voted he voted for Lincoln at the last minute. I learned that in his diary. He said, we just can't, we can't give over to the idea that slavery is going to go into all parts of the country. We can't do that. And then after Fort Sumter, he commented on this radical change in the city that I was just describing. Suddenly the city became very patriotic, and he said, I'm just so relieved because, you know, the Southerners say we're just a bunch of money grubbing, but what we're showing, he says, I've lost, in one of his interests, I've lost half my wealth in the last 3 months. People were losing money in New York, but at least I know we're doing the decent thing. So I found that just very interesting, that a conservative man who says, you know, if we have to make sacrifices, we must, but the nation can't be a slave nation. So people like that, I found myself, you know, really feeling like that he's very human, very, very real, very present.
Principle.
Yeah, principle. There's such a thing. Luckily, a lot of people.
You said the future was ominous, but if we had more people like that man, it wouldn't be.
I don't know. Maybe it's not. It's just what I'm looking around me. And when I was writing this book and looking at the nation, I was thinking, good Lord. We're coming around to something similar, at least. I hope not, but who knows.
Ritchie, all the cotton coming north was manufactured in the north into
Not all of
clothing.
it. A lot of it went to London, I mean, to Liverpool or to France.
So
New
it came
England-
through New York.
Yeah, it came through. It was taken to New York and put onto other ships and sent over. They had that thing. It was just amazing how they'd organized that thing.
Okay.
They had smaller ships to go to the south, larger to go to England.
Yeah, you cite how much they sent, you can quote figures on how
Oh,
much was
yeah.
exported over there.
Yeah,
It's an amazing amount.
An amazing amount.
A lot of the cotton mills were in New England.
That's right.
Ann's mother was from New Bedford. And
Right, yeah.
even now, they're the remnants of the cotton mills.
Yeah.
A lot of it was there.
That was later.
You know, of course, Southerners pointed out that Yankees said what they call wage slavery. Those factories were not pleasant places for men, women, and children to work. And that's how the South would answer people who said, your institution of slavery is inhuman. And they said, well, what about your, you know, starvation wages you pay? Still, there's a difference between being free and being a slave. Being bought and sold. Well, thank you for coming out tonight.